I swear to God, if Staff Sergeant makes us field day these barracks one more time because of dust, I'm gonna lose my mind," Lance Corporal Mike Torres said, dropping his mop into the bucket with enough force to splash dirty water onto his already stained boots. "This building's older than my grandfather. You can't get rid of 70 years of Camp Pendleton dirt in one afternoon." His roommate, Lance Corporal Derek Smith, didn't look up from where he was scrubbing baseboards with a toothbrush. "At least we're not out on humping hills in this heat. I'll take field day over another force march any day." "Boot," Torres muttered, but there was no real heat in it. Smith had been his roommate in the barracks for 8 months now, and somewhere between all the shared misery of Marine Corps life, they'd become actual friends, instead of just guys who happened to share the same 20 by 20 concrete box. The barracks, Building 1775, was a 3-story rectangle of suffering that had housed generations of Marines since the Korean War. From the outside, it looked like every other building in the area. Beige walls, brown roof, and windows that never seemed quite clean no matter how much CLP you used on them. Inside, it was all off-white walls, linoleum floors, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly sick. Torres was just about to call it quits for the night when the lights flickered. Not the normal power surge flicker that happened whenever too many Marines tried to run their PlayStations at once. This was different. Slower, almost deliberate. "Did you see that?" Smith asked, finally looking up from the baseboard. "Yeah," Torres said, frowning at the ceiling. "Probably just..." The rest of his sentence was cut off by the sound of boots on linoleum. Heavy boots, moving with purpose down the hallway outside their room. The kind of walk that usually meant an NCO was about to ruin someone's day. Except it was 21:30, and there shouldn't have been any staff walking through. Not at this hour. "Standing by for a surprise inspection," Smith muttered, but Torres held up a hand. Something wasn't right. The footsteps passed their door and continued down the hall, maintaining that same measured pace. Thump, thump, thump. Then they stopped, right where Torres knew the hallway ended in a solid wall. There was no sound of someone turning around, no door opening or closing, just silence. "Okay, now what the fuck was that?" Smith whispered. Before Torres could answer, the footsteps started again. This time they were coming back, slower, much slower. Torres moved to the door, his hand hovering over the handle. 3 years in the Corps had taught him that the fastest way to deal with weird shit was to confront it head on. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal and pulled. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps were still there, now right in front of him, still moving. The sound of boots on linoleum, clear as day, made by absolutely nothing. "Oh, hell no," Smith said from behind him. "Nah, this is above my pay grade." Torres would have agreed, but his attention was caught by something else. At the end of the hall where the footsteps had stopped, there was a rack, an old-style metal bed frame, the kind they'd phased out years ago. It hadn't been there earlier that day. He was sure of it. And as he watched, something sat down on it. The frame creaked, the thin mattress depressed, creating a perfect impression of someone sitting. Someone they couldn't see. "Smith?" Torres said, keeping his voice steady despite the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Tell me you're seeing this." "If by this you mean a ghost bed with an invisible Marine, then yeah. Hell yeah, I'm seeing it. And I'm really wishing I wasn't." The impression on the mattress shifted, like whoever or whatever was sitting there had turned to look at them. Torres had faced down drill instructors, survived combat training, and once had to explain to his first sergeant why there was a goat in the company office. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. So he did what any good Marine would do. He fell back on protocol. "Good evening," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. "I'm Lance Corporal Torres, and this is Lance Corporal Smith. If you're haunting these barracks, I'm going to need to see your DD-214. Behind him, Smith made a strangled sound that might have been either a laugh or a cry of despair. The impression on the mattress didn't move. "I mean it," Torres continued, amazed at how steady his voice was. "You just can't ghost around here without proper documentation. This is a Marine Corps installation. There are procedures." For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, the impression on the mattress began to fade. The metal frame creaked one last time, and then there was nothing but an empty rack at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Smith grabbed Torres' shoulder. Did you just chase off a ghost by asking for its paperwork?" "Maybe," Torres said, staring at the now empty rack. "But something tells me it's not gone for good. Nothing in the Corps is ever easy that way." He was right. That night was just the beginning, and Building 1775 had a lot more surprises in store for them. Some were terrifying, some were bizarre, but all of them would test the limits of what two Lance Corporals could handle. At least they had each other, and if there was one thing Marines were good at, it was adapting and overcoming, even if the enemy was something that didn't show up in any field manual. The next morning, Torres and Smith debated whether to report what they'd seen. Not that either of them knew exactly how to write that kind of report. "Dear Staff Sergeant, request permission to submit complaint about unauthorized spectral activity in Building 1775. The ghosts failed to present proper EAS paperwork." Torres mimicked typing on an invisible keyboard while they sat in the chow hall. "Shut up and eat your eggs," Smith said, poking at his own breakfast with suspicious determination. "We both know what happens to Marines who start talking about seeing things that aren't there. I'm not trying to spend the rest of my enlistment getting piss tested every other day." Torres had to admit that he had a point. Besides, in the harsh fluorescent light of morning, the whole thing seemed almost ridiculous. Almost. That illusion lasted until they got back to the barracks that evening. Their door was open. "Did you leave it unlocked?" Smith asked, already knowing the answer. No Marine who'd survived 3 months in the barracks ever left their door unlocked. "Negative." Torres approached cautiously, noting how the temperature seemed to drop with each step. Their room was freezing, despite the September heat outside. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it, except for Torres's rack. Every item on it, sheet, blanket, pillow, had been folded with perfect hospital corners. The kind of tight, precise folds that would make a drill instructor weep with joy. "Okay, well, that's different," Smith said, staying in the doorway. "Usually ghosts mess things up, right? This one's doing our bunks?" Torres approached his rack slowly. The folding was immaculate, better than he'd ever managed, even in boot camp. He reached out to touch the blanket. It was cold, and not just cool, but cold enough that his fingers ached. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the edge of the blanket. There, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a name tape, the kind they stopped using decades ago, back when utilities were still made of plain olive drab. The stitching was faded, but he could just make out the letters. Harrison. "Well, that's terrifying," Smith said cheerfully, in the way Marines often did when confronting something completely outside their comfort zone. "At least we have a name now. Think we could look him up?" Torres was about to answer when their phones buzzed simultaneously. New message in the platoon group chat. "All hands, 2000 formation in the quad, full kit inspection, no excuses." They looked at each other, then at the perfectly made rack, then back at their phones. "You think Staff Sergeant planned this, or?" Smith left the question hanging. "At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if our ghost called it himself," Torres said, already moving to get his gear ready. "Probably annoyed at our lack of attention to detail." The formation was exactly as miserable as expected, standing at attention while Staff Sergeant Weber inspected their kit under the harsh parking lot lights. Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by more than just their NCOs. "Torres," Staff Sergeant barked, "your gear is actually acceptable for once. Smith, your canteen's missing its rubber gasket. Fix it." As Weber moved down the line, Torres noticed something odd. The shadow cast by the light pole behind them showed one too many figures in formation. He tried to count without moving his head, maintaining the position of attention. But every time he got close, the numbers seemed to change. Then he felt it, something walking out from behind their rank. The measured steps were identical to what they'd heard in the hallway the night before. Smith must have felt it too, because Torres could see his friend's jaw clenching. Neither of them moved. They'd been in long enough to know that breaking formation was worse than dealing with any supernatural entity. The footsteps stopped directly behind them. There was a sensation of someone leaning forward, inspecting their alignment. Torres could have sworn he felt breath on the back of his neck, despite the fact that it was impossible. "Division," Weber called out. "Fall out." As the formation broke up, Torres turned around, and for just a second, he caught a glimpse of something. The faintest outline of a Marine in old-style utilities. Covers squared away perfectly, ribbons gleaming on his chest, and then it was gone. "Did you?" Smith started. "Yeah." Torres cut him off. "I saw him. Harrison, I'm guessing." "Think he's gonna keep inspecting our stuff?" "Probably. Once a Marine, always a Marine, right? Even after death, apparently." They walked back to the barracks in silence, both lost in thought. It wasn't until they reached their door that Smith spoke again. "You know what the weird part about this is?" he said, checking to make sure no one was within earshot. "I'm actually more worried about failing his inspection than Staff Sergeant's." Torres laughed, but it was a nervous sound, because he felt exactly the same way. That night, as they lay in their racks trying to sleep, the temperature dropped again. Neither of them mentioned it, but they both heard the sound of boots making steady rounds through the building. Every hour on the hour, like clockwork. Just before he drifted off, Torres muttered, "At least we've got the most motivated fire watch in the Corps." From somewhere in the darkness, he could have sworn he heard someone laugh. 3 days after their ghostly encounter at formation, Torres was cleaning his rifle when Smith burst into their room, face pale despite his usually unshakable demeanor. "Dude," Smith said, closing the door behind him with unnecessary care. "I just talked to Ramirez from 2nd Platoon. Apparently Building 1775 has some history we should probably know about." Torres set down his cleaning rod, careful not to let any CLP drip onto his desk. "Yeah? What kind of history?" "The Kind that explains why our resident ghost is such a hard-ass about regulations. Smith sat on his rack, then immediately stood up again, as if unable to stay still. Remember that name tape we found? Harrison? Ramirez says there was a gunnery Sergeant Harrison here in 73. He was famous for being the strictest Marine on base. Guy was basically Arlie Ermy times 10. Let me guess, Torres said, already feeling the temperature in the room starting to drop. Something happened to him in the barracks? Yeah, but not like you'd expect. He didn't die here or anything dramatic like that. The story goes he was getting ready to retire, had his paperwork all set, then just disappeared. And 3 days before his EAS date, nobody ever found him. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, as if in confirmation. Great, Torres muttered. So we've got a ghost who never got to finish his paperwork. Explains a lot, actually. A loud metallic bang made them both jump. It came from Torres' wall locker, the old metal cabinet where they kept their uniforms. As they watched, the door slowly creaked open. Inside, Torres' uniforms had been completely rearranged. His camis were hung with precision spacing, all facing the same direction. His boots, previously thrown in the bottom, were now perfectly aligned, toe lined straight as a laser beam. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Hey, Smith? He said slowly. Please tell me you're seeing what I'm seeing. In the back of the wall locker, behind the uniforms, was another set of camis. Old ones, olive drab utilities that hadn't been issued since Vietnam, pressed and starched to perfection. The name tape read Harrison, and below it was a set of gunnery sergeant chevrons, polished to a mirror shine. Oh yeah, I see it, Smith replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Question is, what do we do about it? Before either of them could move, someone pounded on their door. 3 sharp, authoritative knocks that made both of them snap to attention out of pure instinct. Lance Corporal Torres, Lance Corporal Smith. It was Staff Sergeant Weber. Room inspection in 5 minutes. They looked at each other, then at the wall locker with its impossible contents. Smith summed up their situation perfectly. Well, shit. Torres reached for the wall locker, intending to close it before Staff Sergeant arrived, but the door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder. Nothing. It's stuck, he hissed. 2 minutes. Weber's voice came down the hall, along with the sound of him chewing out some unfortunate Marine about their room's condition. Smith joined Torres at the wall locker, both of them pulling now. The metal door remained fully open, as immovable as if it had been welded into place. The temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath came out in visible puffs of vapor, despite the California heat outside. The old utilities in the back of the lockers seemed to straighten themselves, the creases becoming even sharper. 1 minute. Gunny Harrison, sir? Torres said quickly, addressing the empty air. With all due respect, we can't explain this to Staff Sergeant. Please. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the wall locker doors swung closed on its own. The click of the latch engaging came just as Weber's knock rattled the door. Enter, they called out in unison. What followed was the most thorough room inspection either of them had ever experienced. Weber checked everything, under the racks, behind the desk, inside their refrigerator, but when he got to Torres's wall locker, something odd happened. The staff sergeant reached for the handle, then suddenly pulled his hand back as if shocked. He stared at the locker for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Everything appears to be in order, he said finally, his voice unusually quiet. Carry on." After Weber left, Torres and Smith stood in silence for several seconds. "Did he just," Smith started, "feel something?" "I think he did." Torres approached the wall locker cautiously. This time the door opened normally. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be. No sign of the old utilities, no extra uniforms, but the air still carried a hint of that supernatural cold, and Torres could have sworn he smelled something familiar. The sharp scent of military-grade starch and polish, the kind they didn't even use anymore. "You want to know what's really weird?" Smith said, examining Torres's now perfectly arranged uniforms. "These are actually better than what they were before. Hell, man, look at these creases." He was right. Every uniform was pressed to perfection, each crease sharp enough to cut paper. "Jesus, maybe I should fucking thank him," Torres asked. And as if in response, his bootlaces, which had been properly tucked in, suddenly pulled themselves even tighter. "I'll take that as a yes," Smith said. Then he grinned. "Hey, think we could get him to help him with our monthly inspections?" The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "Take that as a maybe," Torres said, "but something tells me his standards might be higher than staff sergeants." From somewhere in the barracks, they heard the familiar sounds of boots on linoleum, moving with purpose. Gunny Harrison was making his rounds again, and Building 1775's newest residents were starting to realize that having a ghost senior NCO might be both a blessing and a curse. The following week brought a new challenge to Building 1775. A fresh from boot camp private, first class named Rodriguez, who'd been assigned to their floor. Torres and Smith watched from their doorway as the new Marine struggled with his sea bag, looking lost in the way only boot Marines could. "Think we should warn him?" Smith whispered. Torres shook his head. "About what? Our friendly fucking neighborhood ghost? Yeah, that'll go over real well, Smith." They didn't have to wait long to see how Rodriguez would handle the building's supernatural resident. That night, while Torres was working on an essay for his Marine Corps Institute course, they heard the distinct sound of a wall locker being slammed shut, followed by Rodriguez's voice echoing down the hall. "What the fuck? Who keeps touching my shit?" Smith looked up from his rack from where he'd been reading. "Oh, here we go." They heard Rodriguez's door open and close, followed by angry footsteps in the hallway. "Hello? Who's messing with my room?" The temperature started dropping, and now a familiar sign that Gunny Harrison was about to make his presence known. Torres and Smith exchanged glances, debating whether to intervene. Before they could decide, the building's ancient radio crackled to life in Rodriguez's room. Through the thin walls, they could hear the static-filled sound of morning colors playing, despite it being 2200. "What the fuck?" Rodriguez's voice trailed off. The footsteps started then unmistakable sound of boots on linoleum moving with purpose. Torres could picture exactly what Rodriguez was seeing. Nothing but empty hallway, and yet the footsteps were clear as day, getting closer and closer to the boots' room. "Oh, hell no. You gotta be fucking kidding me," Rodriguez said, his voice cracking slightly. "No, boy, there's no fucking way this isn't happening." Then came the sound that they'd been waiting for, the sharp, authoritative knock that both Torres and Smith had come to recognize as Gunny Harrison's signature. Rodriguez must have opened his door because what followed was the distinct sound of someone snapping to attention, followed by a strangled, "Good evening, sir." Torres and Smith looked at each other. Rodriguez had just addressed thin air as sir, which meant he was seeing something that they hadn't yet seen. "You think we should?" Smith gestured towards the door. Torres nodded and they both moved to the hallway, finding Rodriguez standing at rigid attention in his doorway, facing what appeared to be an empty space. Except the air was shimmering slightly, like heat waves off of hot asphalt. Hey, Rodriguez," Torres called out. "You right there, buddy?" Rodriguez didn't move, didn't even blink. "There's a gunnery sergeant, I think, but is he kind of transparent?" Smith offered. "Yeah, it's Gunny Harrison. He's our resident barracks manager." The shimmering air moved and suddenly they could all see him. Not clearly, but enough to make out the outlines of utilities. The distinctive cover, the stern posture that only career Marines seem to perfect. Rodriguez's eyes went wide. "Is this some kind of fucking joke, boys? Some kind of hazing thing?" "Negative," Torres said, keeping his voice steady despite the chill running down his spine. This was the clearest they'd ever seen Harrison manifest. "We think Gunny's been here since 73's. Kind of particular about how things are run." As if to demonstrate, Harrison's semi-visible form moved past Rodriguez into his room. They heard the sound of hangers sliding in the wall locker, then boots being arranged with precise movements. "Your uniform's unserviceable, Private," a voice said, the first time any of them had heard Harrison speak clearly. It was exactly what you would expect from an old-school gunny, gravelly, with a kind of tone that made Lance Corporals instinctively check their gig lines. "Those creases are embarrassing, and your cover looks like it's been shit on and then tossed in the wash." Rodriguez stood there, mouth open, as his uniforms began arranging themselves with supernatural precision. Yes, Gunny Sergeant," he managed to say. "And your boots?" Harrison's form bent down to inspect Rodriguez's footwear. "Jesus fucking Mary and Joseph. What the fuck did they teach you in boot camp? These look like something a Soviet would wear." Torres and Smith tried not to laugh as Rodriguez's boots began polishing themselves, the leather taking on a mirror shine that would have made a drill instructor weep with joy. "Hey, welcome to Building 1775, Smith said, patting Rodriguez on the shoulder. "Standards are high and the senior NCO never sleeps." 2 weeks after Rodriguez's introduction to Gunny Harrison, Building 1775 was buzzing with nervous energy. The battalion commander had announced a surprise health and comfort inspection, and everyone knew it would be the most thorough inspection of the year. "You think Gunny's going to help us out?" Rodriguez asked, now fully accustomed to their supernatural senior NCO. He was getting better at maintaining his military bearing, even while discussing their resident ghost, which Torres had to admit was pretty impressive. "It's hard to say," Smith replied, methodically organizing his wall locker for the third time that morning. "He's been extra active lately. Did you notice how cold it was in the head this morning?" Torres nodded. The bathroom mirrors had actually frosted over while he was taking a shit, and he could have sworn he heard someone calling cadence in the shower area when it was completely empty. "Something's definitely up," Torres said. "He's never been this present before." As if on cue, the temperature plummeted, the fluorescent lights flickered, and then every door in the barracks slammed shut simultaneously. The sound echoed through the building like a rifle volley. "Well, that's new," Smith muttered. Their radio crackled to life, but instead of the usual static or morning colors, they heard something else. What sounded like an old tape recording of a battalion inspection from decades ago. "Attention on deck." The voice was crisp and sharp, and definitely not coming from their cheap radio speakers. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The three Marines exchanged glances, then snapped to attention at a pure instinct. Gunny Harrison materialized in their doorway. Not the usual shimmer or vague outline, but a full apparition. He was wearing pressed utilities from the Vietnam era, his cover perfectly squared, ribbons gleaming on his chest. His face was stern, weathered, exactly what you'd expect from a Marine who'd served through 3 wars. "Listen up, devils," Harrison said, his voice carrying that unique mix of authority and barely contained frustration that all senior NCOs seemed to perfect. "The battalion's commander will be here in exactly 2 hours. This building will be squared away, or I will personally haunt every single one of you until your EAS date. Is that clear, gentlemen?" "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant," they responded in unison. What followed was the most supernatural field day in Marine Corps history. Harrison moved through the building like a force of nature, his presence causing impossible things to happen in every room. Dust didn't just disappear, it evaporated into thin air. Water spots on mirrors vanished with a sound like sizzling bacon. Boots aligned themselves with laser precision, and uniforms and wall lockers straightened their own creases. In the bathroom, tiles began to gleam with an almost otherworldly shine. The shower heads all turned on at once, spraying scalding hot water that somehow left everything spotless instead of wet. "Did he just..." Rodriguez started to ask as they watched their toilet paper rolls fold themselves into perfect triangles. "Don't question it," Torres advised. "You just gotta go with it." Smith was about to respond when Harrison's voice boomed through the building again. "If I see one more improperly stored piece of gear, I will PTT this entire barracks until colors tomorrow morning." "Can a ghost actually make us do PT?" Rodriguez whispered. As if in answer, their dumbbells floated off the floor and began doing perfect military presses in midair. "Well, I think that's a yes," Torres said. A few days later, it started with Rodriguez going missing. Not the normal kind of missing where a Marine doesn't show up for a formation because he's passed out in some oceanside bar. No, Rodriguez had disappeared from his room in Building 1775 at 0300 on a Tuesday morning, leaving behind a half-written letter to his mother and a cup of coffee still steaming on his desk. "Something's wrong," Torres said as they stood in Rodriguez's empty room. "Gunny Harrison's never been on the 3rd floor. Says it's off limits even to him." Smith nodded, staring at the ceiling where dark water stains formed in patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. "Rodriguez went up there last night. He said he heard someone calling for help." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, but this cold was different, sharper, more aggressive. Not Harrison's usual presence. This felt malevolent. "We have to go up there," Torres said, though every instinct told him otherwise. The 3rd floor had been condemned since 1985, after what the old-timers called the incident. No one talked about it, and the stairs were blocked by heavy chains and a padlock that looked older than the both of them combined. But the chains were lying on the ground now, snapped clean through. Their boots echoed differently on the 3rd floor. Hollow, wet-sounding, though the floor was dry. The air smelled wrong, like old blood and seawater. Impossible this far from the coast. Their flashlight beams caught something moving in the darkness ahead. Not Harrison's familiar outline, but something else. Something that crawled along the walls, leaving glistening trails that seemed to pulse in the dim light. "Rodriguez?" Smith called out, his voice tight with tension. A sound came back, not quite a voice, not quite a scream. It could have been Rodriguez's voice once. They found his cover first, floating in a puddle of what they desperately hoped was water. The liquid was black in their flashlight beams, and the cover was moving, twisting itself into impossible shapes. "Smith," Torres whispered. "I don't think Gunny Harrison is the only thing haunting this building." The temperature dropped again, and this time they heard footsteps. Not Harrison's measured stride, but something dragging itself toward them, leaving wet marks on the floor that looked disturbingly like handprints. When Harrison's voice cut through the darkness, sharp as a knife, "Get out! Now!" They didn't need to be told twice. They ran, the sound of something pursuing them echoing off the walls. Just before they reached the stairs, Torres glanced back. He saw Rodriguez, or what was left of him. The thing wearing Rodriguez's face smiled at them with too many teeth, its eyes reflecting their flashlight beams like a cat's. Harrison suddenly appeared between them and the thing that wasn't Rodriguez. His form more solid than they'd ever seen it, and for the first time, they saw real fury in the ghost Gunny's face. "This is why the third floor is off limits, devils," Harrison growled. "Now move. I can't hold it back forever." They made it back to their floor, slamming the stairwell door behind them. The sound that followed, metal tearing, concrete cracking, would haunt their dreams for months. Rodriguez was back at formation the next morning, with no memory of what had happened. But sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he smiled that strange smile. And Harrison? He never spoke of that night again, but his rounds became more frequent, his inspections more thorough, and he always watched the stairwell to the third floor, standing guard against whatever waited in the darkness above. Some things, Torres realized, were better left alone. Even in the core, there were orders you didn't question, and places you didn't go. Building 1775 had its own hierarchy of horror, and Gunny Harrison, it seemed, was just the first line of defense.